So I'm going to talk about this subject, but before I do, I'd like to begin with just a sort of plug for my home university, for Yale University, and point out the fact that we have a center that's quite similar to this, that's been around since 1997, so the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition. This was originally founded by David Bryan Davis, who is a scholar of slavery that I hope many of you will recognize, who's also worked on the history of slavery as a global phenomenon, primarily in the modern world. And I capture this particular version of the web page, which is constantly changing, because it also lists the fact that there was a conference that I sponsored last week that was also on comparative slavery, but comparing more Atlantic world slavery with ancient slaveries, ancient Greco-Roman slavery, and we had experts in both fields arrive in New Haven and offer their insights into this problem. So I think comparative slavery is becoming a very important thing to do. In fact, it went so well in New Haven, which I hasten to point out. Mikhail Zoyska talked about the Amistad ship, that the Amistad ship, of course, docked in New Haven in 1839 when these slaves under this leader, Cinque, this Mende leader, took over the ship, and where they wound up in New Haven, which is where the trials took place about the status of those slaves. So, and then from New Haven, we skip over to Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, which was founded by a family of slave traders, essentially. The money that they made was for slave trading, and in 2012, they initiated their own Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice that's also outstanding in this field. They're going to host a conference very similar to the one that we had in New Haven in about a year in order to continue the exploration of this theme of comparative slavery. So there's lots of room globally for these kinds of interests, and I'm very happy to be part of this Bonn initiative that you've put together, because it really is a marvelous thing, and it shows what an excellent university this is. So speaking then to my theme, I'm going to try to keep things to about 40 minutes of talk so that there'll be more time for questions, perhaps. I want to talk about the phenomenon of guilt as it's associated with slavery cross-culturally. So I'm going to do kind of what Fernanda did and make an effort to jump across cultures and times in a way that I'm sure I'm not qualified to do, but I'll do my best here. And I'm going to do it in 4 parts, each of which is going to bring us closer to the situation in the contemporary American world. But I'm going to start with something from 20th century America, and that is a quotation from this person, Gus Jabbo Rogers, who was born into slavery and then freed after 1865, after the end of the Civil War, in other words, and whose own story of slavery was then retranslated for us through the Federal Writers Project that was initiated under Franklin Roosevelt. So lots and lots of former slaves spoke out about what their experience had been. But it's interesting to listen to Jabbo Rogers, who says, God gave it, that is religion, to Adam, and took it away from Adam, and gave it to Noah. And you know, Miss, and Miss would be the interviewer, Noah had 3 sons, and when Noah got drunk on wine, one of his sons laughed at him. And the other 2 got a sheet and walked backwards and threw it over Noah. Noah told the one who laughed, your children would be hewers of wood and drawers of water for the other 2 children, and they will be known by their hair and their skin being dark. So, miss, there we are, and that's the way God meant us to be. We've always had to follow the white folks and do what they saw, what we saw them do, and that's all there is to it. You just can't get away from what the Lord said. And this kind of painful quotation about a person who had assimilated the ideology of the slaveholding class to the extent that he bought into this story also gets at kind of the fundamental problem that I want to talk about, and that is that slavery cross-culturally is often, not always, but is often associated with some sort of guilt. That the slave is told that they are enslaved is because of their guilt or some ancestral guilt of their people, and that sadly, in many instances, they accept that as a reality. And I'd like to keep in mind, or us to keep in mind as I go forward, that because of this phenomenon, this psychological phenomenon, that we have to understand, for better or worse, that the enslaved are part of the project, that they have to buy into their own enslavement on some level. If they don't, resistance will occur even unto the point of death, perhaps overthrowing the slave system, as happens in a Haitian revolt, but that in essence, slavery is kind of a dialogic process between slaveholder and enslaved, in which willy-nilly the slaves must be convinced that this is justifiable, necessary, somehow intrinsic to their situation. And I'm going to take us now to early Han China that Fernando was just talking about, and note that this phenomenon certainly occurs in this quotation that I take from Clarence Wilbur's now very old book on slavery in China during the former Han Dynasty, which someone needs to rewrite. But Wilbur reports, the famous scholar and legal authority, Cheng Shan, or Zheng Chuan, explains in his commentary to the Chu Li that in ancient times, males and females drawn into trial, that is to say related to people tried in court, were seized by the government as slaves. Also that contemporary male and female slaves were the descendants of, or the same as, criminals of antiquity. So that in other words, the story that underlies Chinese slavery in this period, and as we've just learned, Chinese slavery changes at different periods, is that the enslaved are people who either were criminals or who had ancestral criminality in their background that justified their enslavement. And some of this comes through in the documentary sources. You'll see an image that looks just like the one that Fernanda had, that comes from these recently published documents that Anthony Barbieri Lowe and Robin Yates have given us in their Law, State, and Society in Imperial China, this 2-volume work that has all these now bamboo strips with writings of a law code from the earliest Han Dynasty from Changjiang Shan. Tomb 247. And here we can see that even before the Han, so in the Qin, there was a relatively developed system of captive slavery that Fernanda just talked about, and that then the Han incorporate that into a Confucian family structure that they're interested in supporting as a way of governing social structuring, and that it more clearly defines a distinction between freedom and slavery, as we also learned about in the previous talk, that then those who are enslaved for crimes become kind of the lowest rung on a complex social ladder, so that you do not need to have been a war captive. You can simply be someone who's convicted of a crime or held to be a criminal in order to be set into slavery. And much the same story also obtains in Korea, in both the Koryo and the Choson period, when there are very large numbers of people who were enslaved or enserfed, depending on how you want to look at their condition. And this goes back to a story about the mythical founder of Korea, Ki-ja, who supposedly enacts this, well, who does enact this penal code with 8 provisions, one of which is on penal slavery. So an entire 8th of this code is devoted to the question of penal slavery. And furthermore, this epic of Korean history, the Koryosa, includes an addendum on slavery that attributes hereditary slavery to Ki-ja. So says that this legendary founder of Korean monarchy is in fact, in Korean society you could say, is in fact the originator of the idea that slaves are there as descendants of thieves. So that in James Palais' book on his book on Confucian practices and society in Korea, he translates this passage of the Koryosa. Those slaves who were passed on from generation to generation and employed in the families of the sajak, that is to say scholar officials, will called sanobi, private slaves. So that there is an entire system of privately owned slaves, and that these people are thought to be inheritors of a tradition that originally traces to a form of criminality. Similar things can be witnessed in captive-taking societies in what is today Bolivia. On the Valpes River Valley, the Tucano people invaded the territory of the neighboring Macu people, and they took them over as kind of permanent serfs. And in this situation, the Tucano treated these people as sort of permanent criminals or people who were guilty of some crime that merited their enslavement to the dominant Tucanos. And they claimed that they had this, therefore, permanent entitlement to hold the Maku as a kind of slave race, that they were an inferior race on the basis of their barbarian behaviors and their tendency toward criminality. I'll jump then back across the Atlantic to Visigothic society, so that society that dominates the Iberian Peninsula in the period between the 5th and the early 8th centuries CE. And the Visigoths have left us an extensive law code that lately I've been in the process of translating from its medieval Iberian Latin into English. And in that law code, we'll see that huge numbers of people go into slavery via criminal liability. That, in other words, Visigothic society is a society that Orlando Patterson would characterize as having a system of extrusive slavery as opposed to a system of invasive slavery. So that rather than going out and looking for slaves in slaving zones of the sort that Damian talks about, Damian Parga, who's in the room, and also Jeffrey Finpal talk about, they don't go out and seek their slaves. Most of their slaves come from inside of their society. They extrude them from their society using criminality or guilt. And I won't read through all of these methods for falling into enslavement. And in fact, this is just a sampling of things that can cause you to go into slavery if you are convicted of criminal or delictal behavior in Visigothic society. But you can see that there are both privately held slaves, and then there are slaves held by the crown, and that depending on the offense that you've committed, you'll fall into slavery to this person. So that once again, we get this idea that participation in guilt, that guilt activities are somehow triggers for enslavement. I believe that this also then translates into the revival or the intensification of slavery and serfdom practices again in high medieval Iberia. Specifically, I'm thinking here of a book by my colleague Paul Friedman about the rise of serfdom in the high Middle Ages in sort of the 12th to 14th century in Iberia, and particularly Catalonia, primarily through this legal tool that they call the mals usos, that is to say that by virtue of participation in some sort of guilt, often peasants are associated with either some kind of marital mispractice or especially with arson, even if they've never committed arson, and therefore become automatically enslaved by virtue of this conception that they have been guilty somehow. And the same thing could be said of Islamic societies, so that I quote here from Ali bin Muhammad al-Jurjani in 1413 when he says, "Slavery is a debility theoretically produced by law, which originally was a penalty for unbelief." So that unbelief constitutes a crime of sorts. It's a guilt action that leads to slavery. Or a similar notion in Ahmad bin Yahya al-Wansharisi, that says in 1508, "Slavery is a humiliation and a servitude caused by previous or current unbelief, and having as its purpose to discourage unbelief." So it's a trigger for enslavement if you're not a believer, and that if you become a believer, you're at least theoretically free from the bonds of slavery, or free from becoming enslaved at least. And this similar idea continues into the 19th century, when we find out that kafara, that denying the existence of Allah, is a trigger again for enslaving North African Muslims in the 1870s. I jump back now in time to Ahmed Baba of Timbuktu, who had been taken captive in battle, in the Battle of Tondibi, by Moroccans in 1591, and says, "The reason for enslavement is," so a scholar though, "is disbelief. The position of unbelieving Negroes is the same as that of other unbelievers, Christians, Jews, Persians, Turks, etc. Anyone, if he persists in his original unbelief, may be made a slave, whether he is descended from Ham or not. In this respect, there is no difference between the races." So that all you have to do is be guilty of that crime of unbelief, and you're liable for enslavement. The reference there to Ham takes us to the second part of the talk on Abrahamic religions, which include, of course, Islam and also Judaism and Christianity. The reference is, of course, to the story in Genesis 9 about Noah and the curse that he inflicts upon one of his 3 sons. There was also the same reference that we started the lecture with when we talked about Gus Jabbo and his conviction that it was Noah's son's sin that led to the enslavement of black people. So the story is, the sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These 3 were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. And that's important, that basically all people come from one of these 3 originators. Noah was the first tiller of the soil. He planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his 2 brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it upon their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from this wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers." So that Noah's embarrassment, Noah's shaming by his own son, the son's sin, created a guilt bond that allowed him or permitted Noah to enslave, interestingly, not Ham, but rather Canaan, his son. And we'll get back to that contradiction. And this then gets repeated in Jewish and Christian sources and eventually in Muslim sources as well. So that Philo, writing in Greek, but a Jewish writer in the 1st century CE, says, "These remarks have been made solely for the purpose of showing that Ham, the son of Noah, is a name for vice in the quiescent state, and the grandson, Canaan, for the same when it passes into active movement. For Ham is by interpretation heat, and Canaan tossing." So these are obviously etymological arguments about the Hebrew words. Now, no legislator fixes a penalty against the unjust when in the quiescent state, but only when they are moved to action and commit the deeds to which injustice prompts them. Just as in this case, in the case of animals that bite, unless they are going to bite, no wish to kill them would be felt by any right-minded person. So in other words, Philo is explaining A, the origins of slavery, but B, why it is that Canaan and not Ham is the one who's punished, because Canaan is actually enacting somehow etymologically the sin of his father. We get these, in other words, loose chains of causality, but in the end the result is that guilt is responsible for enslavement. And then skipping over many, many references in Christianity and just focusing in on this one, we read similar sentiments in Augustine. "For it is with justice we believe that the condition of slavery is the result of sin. And this is why we do not find the word slave in any part of Scripture until righteous Noah branded the sin of his son with this name. It is a name, therefore, introduced by sin and not by nature. But by nature, as God first created us, no one is the slave either of man or of sin. This servitude is, however, penal, and is appointed by that law which enjoins the preservation of the natural order and forbids its disturbance. For if nothing had been done in violation of that law, there would have been nothing to restrain by penal servitude." So here again we have a kind of genealogy of this idea if we jump forward 4 centuries from Philo. And in fact, we're nevertheless left with all kinds of conceptual problems here. I think that a number of us, and particularly the previous talk, gave us the impression that justifying slavery is very difficult for everyone, and that doing it using the Ham story is particularly difficult because, first of all, of this association of Canaan with Ham. That is to say that if Ham's the one who commits the sin by laughing at his father, then why is it that Canaan gets punished? Rabbinic sources argue that because God had already blessed the sons of Noah, he had to curse Canaan instead. By the 4th to 8th centuries, we have a number of sources that have been assembled in this great book by David Goldenberg, The Curse of Ham, that say that Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources all saw this slippage between Canaan and Ham as kind of indistinguishable, so that at times they attribute the curse to Canaan and at times to Ham, and it doesn't seem to matter to them anymore who precisely got cursed. There's also then another conceptual leap that occurs more in the 7th century that attributes Ham's name to the Hebrew word for blackness, and therefore associates this with the curse of black African peoples. The confusion is already kind of present in the passage that I quoted you from Philo, that Ham's name derives from heat or burning. You can see that there's this problem or this tendency in the Hebrew philology. By the 7th century, we get the notion of a double curse, that what's being cursed is Ham, but also blackness in general. And we also begin language in the Muslim and in the Arabic and the Hebrew sources of a Banu Ham or B'nai Ham, that is to say, a house of Ham or tribe of Ham, that describes black Africa more broadly. So this giant sort of smear campaign that says that Ham's sin is the sin of an entire people. So let's now move to modernity. I want to start with another sort of off-putting quotation like the one that I began with. This comes from a writer in 1857 who was on the pro-slavery side of the debates going on in America at that time. And in his The Great Question Answered, or Is Slavery a Sin in Itself per se, answered according to the teaching of the Scriptures, of course, he is able to enlist the Scriptures, as had so many before him, in order to say that God justified slavery through this curse. Ham deserved death for his unfilial and impious conduct, but the great lawgiver saw fit in his good pleasure not to destroy Ham with immediate death, but to set a mark of degradation on him. All Ham's posterity are either black or dark colored, and thus bear upon their countenance the mark of inferiority which God put upon the progenitor. So this is classic white racism in America in 1857 that's linking or justifying white racism with this story of the guilt of Ham. Remember that I said earlier that one problem with slavery is somehow you have to convince the enslaved that what's happening is right in a sort of cosmological level. Not necessarily that they're enjoying a happy life at all, but that they're getting what God or what the universe intends for them. And in fact, when we read the slave narratives, we often see this, sadly, that slaves have been indoctrinated into their own suppression. So I just quote from two things here. One is from the famous life of Equiano, where Equiano says in a number of places, but at one I quote, "I felt that the Lord was able to disappoint me in all things, and immediately considered my present situation a judgment of heaven on account of my presumption in swearing." So apparently, he worked on shipboard and stuff, and he had a foul mouth. I mean, he would say lots of swear words, and every time he would, he knew that was why he was staying in slavery, because he kept committing a sin. He kept, through guilt, further implicating himself in his slavery. And then I quote another source that I think is the only slave narrative to survive from Greco-Roman antiquity, Jerome's Life of Malchus, where the enslaved, the person who's enslaved actually to nomadic Arabs, to Saracens. It's a monk named Malchus who had disobeyed his abbot and left the monastery in order to go visit his parents, and then captured. And he says, "My captivity made me happy, and I gave thanks for the judgment of God that he'd gotten captured. Because the monk I had left to perish back in my homeland, I had now rediscovered in the desert. So thank goodness I was taken into slavery, because that was God's punishment of me, so I would live more like a desert monk again," is what he's saying. This idea of the connection between guilt and slavery is perhaps best crystallized in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which of course abolished slavery. But if we read it carefully, it says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So America actually hasn't abolished slavery, right? It's abolished slavery in every instance except in the instance of crime. And this out clause is then taken advantage of by particularly white Southerners in the period of post-Reconstruction and following. So from the 1870s and following, we begin to witness the rise of the so-called convict labor leasing program, in which prisoners were put in chain gangs often and forced to work in state or often as not private corporations as quasi-slaves. And this is something that came to the attention of the particularly first Roosevelt, so the Theodore Roosevelt administration, at the very beginning of the 20th century, and is then captured particularly well in a book by the famous left-wing historian and writer John Spivak called Georgia Nigger in 1932. The person who has written about this most recently is Douglas Blackmun, who wrote his book Slavery by Another Name, The Re-Enslavement of Black Americans from the Civil War to World War II in 2008. The book describes in great detail the process that the Southern mentality went through in order to cook up these schemes. And I'll just read to you in their own words from Thomas Good Jones, who wrote in 1903, "The plan is to accuse the Negro of some petty offense and then require him, in order to escape conviction, to enter into an agreement to pay his accuser so much money and sign a contract under the terms of which his bondsman can hire from him until he pays a certain sum." Or can hire him out until he pays a certain sum. The Negro is made to believe he is a convict and treated as such. So black Americans were, in other words, in this period of the early 20th century in particular, often arrested for minor offenses, things like loitering, which is an English word that simply means, walking around seemingly with no purpose. And they'd be convicted of the crime, and then they'd be fined an amount they were unable to pay, and sold into a kind of debt peonage that was essentially slavery, since they were then often, as I said, worked on chain gangs in mines, in salt pits, in logging operations, etc. In this situation, convicts could be bought and sold between different stakeholders. And the stakeholders were often, as I say, private corporations and not publicly owned prisons. If they became fugitive, they were chased down with dogs, with bloodhounds, and if they were felt to be dangerous, they would be shot. Whippings were common in this situation, and state and local prisons were then integrated with a system of private and public commerce so that the two could work seamlessly together. Federal prosecutions of this only began in 1901 and continued on really up to World War II, but particularly in the period between 1901 and 1930. In the 1930s, the United States, great detail, so this is James Q. Whitman's book on America, Hitler's model in America, about Hitler's race laws and how many of those were based on existing state. In other words, the United States provided Nazi Germany with lots of good ideas about how to do racial politics. So that, in other words, these prosecutions go up to 1930 and then kind of cease because that period of America, it's not that the situation gets better, it's that America stops attempting to do anything about it really until the end of World War II. But on some level the problem continues in my country right up to the present. So since the 1970s, the prison population in the United States has grown exponentially, and particularly since the crime bill of the 1990s. So since the early 1970s, the prison and jail population in the United States has increased by 500%, resulting in a total of 2.2 million people behind bars. And of that total, 900,000 were African American, so nearly a half, even though the African American population in the United States is nowhere near that. So it's about 14% of the total. 1 in 6 African American males has been imprisoned as of 2000, had been imprisoned as of the year 2001. And this is a problem that we're still dealing with, but maybe trying to begin to cope with in the United States now, in no small part because of popular culture and because of mass movements that are bringing this to the attention of the federal government. In terms of popular culture, a film that, if you're interested in this problem, anyone should see is Ava DuVernay's 13th, about this 13th Amendment, the amendment that abolished slavery, but not really, so that the criminal justice system, and particularly systems of guilt-making, can be used in order to virtually enslave people. Also, an excellent book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, which goes into some of the same details, but not in documentary film fashion. Sorry, Ava DuVernay's is a film. And then also Elizabeth Hinton, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration in America, which came out in 2016. All these show the way that contemporary American penal culture, and particularly the system of private incarceration, since there's a number of prison corporations in America that benefit greatly both from collecting money from the state for the incarceration of human beings, and then also from the labor that they expropriate from those incarcerated persons, usually for free or virtually for free. So that, in contemporary America, corporations like Chevron, one of the big oil corporations, or Pierre Cardin, or Victoria's Secret, etc., have made considerable. Apple computers have made money from prison labor, which pays on average 23 cents an hour. And I would contend that this same problem spills over into the contemporary American issues with immigration as well. America has gotten very used to having a large population of undocumented people who usually immigrate from Central and South America, and who wind up in the United States without citizenship rights and therefore without claims to legal protections, and with the result that they can also be exploited as laborers at very low rates and under conditions that are unacceptable, and sometimes even under true slave conditions, as for example happened in Florida with the Immokalee workers, who were literally, essentially enslaved, picking tomatoes for large food corporations. This mentality then spills over into the Trump era, which we're in right now, insofar as the contemporary anger about and the contemporary use of this problem as a way to stir up politics in the United States, I think, has very much to do with guilt as well. The concept that these people are entering the United States illegally is the trigger for their then virtual enslavement or treatment as virtual slaves in contemporary America. And just to give you another sort of voice from the kind of person who thinks this way, this is just something that I grabbed from a website by Ulysses Arnn. His website is called Red State, from a posting on June 13th, 2013. According to government estimates, 40% of those in this country illegally are here because they overstayed, he's not a good speller, their visas, and the rest sneaked across the border or hidden boats or planes. Every last one of them violated the laws of this nation. They're guilty, right? We are a nation of laws, after all. As Thomas Paine wrote in his pamphlet, Common Sense, in America, the law is king. These millions upon millions who have violated our nation's laws, or in one way or another, do not deserve to be rewarded with a pathway to citizenship. What they deserve is a boot to the ass as they are kicked out of this country, preferably by way of self-deportation. So that shows you the kind of mentality that can fuel this, and the way that it's connected up with the language of guilt that we've seen is so inherent in notions, at least of justification of slavery, and often in actually triggering enslavement. That there's that slippage between these ideas that seems so easy for the human mind to make cross-culturally. So to conclude, I've spoken about guilt specifically, but I'd like to draw some larger conclusions about slavery and kind of the contradictions that are inherent in slavery, that slavery in general is something that cannot deny the humanity of the person who is enslaved, but nevertheless tries to treat them using legal structures that we use to characterize property. So that this is one of the many built-in contradictions to slavery, that a person, it's the last slide, can simultaneously be property and a human being. And whenever, in fact, it comes to criminal prosecutions, that's in fact where slaves are most commonly treated as humans, so that in almost all slave societies, if the slave commits a crime, then they're tried as a criminal. In other instances, slaves are never allowed any kind of legal personage in court, or at least have very restricted legal personages in court. So that we do get the idea that the slave's personality qua human being can never be fully denied, is never fully denied by any slave system, and yet we treat them as property. There's also this contradiction between the slave as a living creature and the slave as dead, or at least socially dead. That's a concept that's obviously stretches back to Orlando Patterson's famous book of 1982 that's already been referenced before. Some people critique that definition or that notion that slavery is in any way social death, but personally I think it works quite well. I think that because of the contradiction, you can never deny the lives of slaves, and that slaves always manage somehow to assert their humanity, and often, in great and incredibly florid ways, they're able to demonstrate that they are people, just like anyone, just like their oppressors. And yet, the society's effort in keeping them in slavery is to keep them socially dead, to keep them alive as a sort of animal or tool, but not to allow them any kind of life within the society or the community to which they belong. There's also this contradiction between violence and integration, and I think that gets at some of the problems that Michael Zeuske deals with in his book, that you have these sort of householding slaveries or captive-taking slaveries where people are taken into a society and kept there and then gradually oftentimes integrated into the society, and that bleeds over into things like Roman slavery that, as Fernando talked about, often leads to manumission and then freedom and full integration into the society, or even sometimes just partial integration into the society. So that slavery is constantly pulling in both directions. Some people are permanently stuck in the violence of the slavery, and then other people escape from that and become integrated. And also with the idea that slavery is in fact a legal fiction, that it is something that has to be accepted by the society and on some level by the slaves. That because of that, it's always a question of justice, that slavery has to be justified using laws, and that's in fact what Fernando Piri's talk was all about, that there are legal explanations for slavery in every society that holds slaves. And yet, there's an awareness that it is unjust somehow, that we therefore have to justify it, and that came up quite clearly in her discussion of this Roman idea that slavery is not a phenomenon of the jus civile, of the Roman way of doing law, but it is a phenomenon of the jus gentium, of everybody's laws. I would say that the Romans actually think of their own laws as influenced by jus gentium too, but that everybody does slavery. So even though we Romans don't do this qua Romans, we do it as participants in this global legal system, and therefore justify the injustice that we know we're perpetrating. Same way with the question of legality and criminality, that slavery is on some level the legalization of something that would be at least amicably regarded as illegal. So going out and capturing people would be illegal if you're doing that with your own people, but as long as you're doing it to other people, you're allowing for this criminal behavior to occur as a legal phenomenon. Or even inside your own society, if you have an extrusive slave system, then you use that trigger of guilt that I've been talking about as a way to say, well, you were a member of our society, but by virtue of your guilt, your implication in some criminal or delictal activity, you get excluded from it. And then finally, the phenomenon of absorption and adoption, that you're taking these people into your society, but usually keeping them at arm's length, preventing them from being full members of the society. And yet at the same time, almost all slave societies involve something of the language of the family or familiarity, that the slave is part of you, is one of you, is an inferior version of you, and we're adopting you into our culture, but on very limited terms. And there again, I think that the guilt concept can help with that, to understand that because you or your ancestors or something have been guilty of some irredeemable crime, we'll keep you in this inferior status, even as we've taken you into our society and are absorbing or adopting you there. So, ganz herzlichen Dank.